Okay. So, it's a pleasure to have Teresa Robertson here from the University of California at Santa Barbara, UCSB.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
She's going to talk about a puzzle, a very interesting puzzle about natural kinds.
It's very interesting, yes.
Very interesting. Thanks for being here, Teresa.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And yeah, I feel like I need to apologize to you and Jonathan and Brano, and well, maybe I don't have to apologize to you for having me hear this talk a second time. He learns something every time. Yeah. So. Anyway, so here we go. In this paper, I present a puzzle having to do with kinds, and to some extent at least, the ways in which we talk about them. The organization of the paper is very simple. First, I'll present the puzzle, and more precisely, a particular version of the puzzle that concerns the natural kind of water. Then I discuss some possible solutions to the puzzle, and by the end of the paper, it will be clear what solution I favor. But I stress that I consider the work here to be just a preliminary and tentative defense of that solution, or as Brano would say, this is not yet maturing.
This is immature.
Yes. Yes. So consider the natural kind water. We know a lot about this kind. We know, for example, that all instances of it are composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. That is evidently something that we learned empirically. Moreover, it's something that we could not have learned any other way.
How did we reach?
Yet I will argue that this claim conflicts with a set of claims, each of which is independently plausible. Therein lies the puzzle. So on the handout, I've got the puzzle. And I'm just going to read through it first so that you know what it is, and then I'll explain some of the terminology and so on. So one is sameness of metaphysical intention is sufficient for sameness of kind. And that just means if you have 2 kinds such that it's metaphysically impossible for them to differ in their instances, then you've really only got 1 kind. 2, the metaphysical intention of the kind water is the same as the metaphysical intention of the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O. So I've adopted this convention of italicizing the expressions that refer to kinds. Anyway, so 2, another way to say that is just to say it's metaphysically impossible for the kinds water and the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O to differ in their instances. From those 2 claims, 3 follows. The kind water is the same as the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. 4 is the claim that one can know a priori of the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, that all instances of it are composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. And then from 3 and 4 it follows, 5 follows. One can know a priori of the kind water that all instances of it are composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O. In my favorite formulation of claim 1, the formulation that isn't in the parentheses, I adopt the terminology of the metaphysical extension or intention of a kind by analogy to the semantic extension or intention of a kind term or its corresponding predicate. So I adopt that from Nathan's reference in essence. The idea is that whatever kinds are, they're universals of some sort, things that have instances. Those instances are the things that we say are of the kind or that we say belong to the kind. The metaphysical extension of a kind at a world W is simply the set of its instances at W. The metaphysical intention of a kind, then, is the function that assigns to any possible world the metaphysical extension of that kind at that world. This terminology allows for a nice sloganish version of the first claim that doesn't require scare quotes. The distinction between the metaphysical extension or intention of a kind and the semantic extension or intention of a kind term, or its corresponding predicate, calls attention to the fact that we need to keep 3 things distinct in our thinking: a kind term, and the kind term's corresponding predicate. We're used to distinguishing between kinds and kind terms, but just to be explicit, let me say that I take a kind term to be any expression that designates any kind whatsoever, right? Whether the expression is a single word, like pencil, a compound common noun phrase, like guy who won't take no for an answer, or a general definite description, the colorless, odorless, thirst-quenching liquid that fills the lakes and streams, right? So all of those different kinds of expressions I take to be kind terms because they designate kinds, right? And you can see from the examples that I don't care whether the kind that's designated is natural, like the colorless, odorless, thirst-quenching liquid that fills the lakes and streams, or not, like pencil. We should also distinguish between kind terms and their corresponding predicates. Again, just to be explicit, let me say that I take a predicate corresponding to a kind term to be a predicate formed from the kind term together with the is or is-a of predication. Now, you've seen from Reyno's paper that this is something that Nathan thinks, and I take this to be a very natural thought, and it came up for me when I was, actually I think I gave this paper here criticizing Penelope Mackey, where it seems like she really doesn't take seriously that a predicate is composed of, you know, this helping verb, right, and a kind term, and so she failed to see that when you form predicates in this way and then make sentences with them, you wind up saying something about the kind itself as well as, you know, whatever the subject term designated. All right, so premise one has a reasonable degree of intuitive support. Scott Soames says in his recent paper, What Are Natural Kinds? Speaking there specifically of natural kinds, of course, it's hard to imagine two distinct species of animals, two distinct substances, or two distinct colors which have precisely the same instances in every possible world state. And in that paper, Soames in fact endorses one on the basis of this intuition about species, substances, and colors. I'm basing this attribution to Scott Soames in part on email conversations with him, so I feel like I should say that it may be that it's better to attribute to him something weaker than one. So in an earlier paper of his called Knowledge of Manifest Natural Kinds, he endorsed a weaker view that sameness of metaphysical intention is sufficient for sameness of what he calls manifest natural kind, where manifest natural kinds are designated by terms like water, tiger, gold, green, and electricity. And he says, and I quote, individual instances of these kinds are objects of our potential acquaintance about which we may have de re knowledge. Natural kinds of a more highly theoretical sort, like photons and neutrons, are not included in this category. In any case, I think the puzzle remains even if we substitute the weaker claim, right, that sameness of metaphysical intention is sufficient for sameness of manifest natural kind. I think we still have a puzzle instead of the claim, the stronger claim of one. About 30 years before Soames's endorsement, Salmon mentioned in reference in essence that the view has some intuitive support when he said, quote, it is not impossible that kinds having the same metaphysical intention are identical. Sorry, it is not implausible that kinds having the same metaphysical intention are identical, so that the metaphysical intention of a kind uniquely determines the kind in question. Of course, that's a long way from an endorsement of one, but it does suggest that one has at least some degree of intuitive support. Premise 2 assumes that we can designate kinds both by single word common nouns and by compound common noun phrases. It's relatively uncontroversial that certain single word common nouns designate kinds, take vixen or bachelor, for example. It's also relatively uncontroversial that those kinds are also designated by the compound common noun phrases female fox and unmarried man, respectively. And each of the two italicized common noun phrases in 2, so is it water and matter composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, each of those 2 italicized common noun phrases appears, at very least, to designate a kind. And that claim, too, assumes the post-naming and necessity conventional philosophical wisdom about waters having its chemical composition necessarily. If you don't accept that sort of essentialism, then substitute your favorite relevant example of the necessary a posteriori, and if you don't think that there are any such examples, then you've got this puzzle sort of gives you an argument for your view, because one way you could deal with this is by saying everything else is great, but we need to reject 2. The inference from 1 and 2 to 3 involves only universal instantiation and modus ponens. I think it's impeccable. Reasonable questions can be raised concerning 4, and I will turn to those in a moment, but for now I want to emphasize 4's prima facie plausibility. Just think about other cases. One can know a priori of the kind bachelor that all of its instances are unmarried. One can know a priori of the kind female fox that all of its instances are female. One can know a priori of the kind brown-eyed girl that all of its instances are brown-eyed. 4 is just another instance of this general phenomenon. Because 4 involves de re knowledge, the inference from 3 and 4 to 5 is licensed by Leibniz's law, or the indiscernibility of identicals. And I say here, I'm a big fan of Leibniz's law. It's hard to do philosophy fruitfully without it, and then I need to confess that it's hard to do philosophy anyway, but it's a little easier to do it when we have Leibniz's law. That's about all I have to say about that. So 5 conflicts with the observation with which I started, namely that the only way that we could have learned of the kind water, that all its instances are composed of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, is empirically. So there are 6 potential solutions to this puzzle, right? We can reject 1 or 2, or we could reject the inference from 2, 3. We could reject 4, or the inference to 5, or we could reject the intuition that one cannot know a priori of the kind water, that all its instances are composed of 2 parts H and 1 part O, right, which just amounts to accepting 5. And in what follows, I won't bother considering the solutions that involve rejecting the inferences. I'll consider the other 4 possibilities and what I take to be the order of increasing plausibility. Maybe I'll just mention that this puzzle can be extended a little bit. So from 5, if we were millions about water, right, the term water, if we're millions about the term water, right? We can get from 5 to 6, right? We can import water since its content is just what it designates, and I take it to designate the substance. Water, and so if you feel like maybe you can tolerate 5, that we have de re knowledge of water, but maybe not thinking of it as water or something. Maybe you think you can tolerate 5. This though 6 seems pretty intolerable, right? And I take it we do, not just out of politeness, but we do actually have to take millionism as a serious contender, right? So not just out of politeness in this group, but there are the arguments that against descriptivism for water are quite powerful, and at least I don't think there's a whole lot of room between descriptivism and millionism about that term. All right, so first I'm going to consider rejecting premise 2. Although I'm going to assume that we're accepting, the sort of the Kripke-Putnam kinds of considerations for thinking that water is essentially composed of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. Anyway, some philosophers may find it tempting to reject 2 on the ground that at least one of the at least alleged kind terms fails to designate a kind. In the case of the particular version of the puzzle that I've presented, presumably the idea would be that matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O, that phrase fails to designate a kind because kinds aren't gerrymandered entities of the sort they would have to be if it did. I don't myself have any such minimalist tendencies. I don't have a theory of kinds, but I suspect that a proper theory of kinds will look something like set theory. For example, I think that for any 2 kinds, there's a kind that is the kind intersection of those 2 kinds. Right? So if there's a kind girl and the kind brown-eyed thing, then there's the kind brown-eyed girl. I don't think that there's a kind corresponding to every common noun phrase, right? Just as there's no Russell set, that is the set of sets that aren't members of themselves, there's no kind corresponding to the common noun phrase, kind that is not an instance of itself. And of course, a proper theory of kinds won't include an analog of the axiom of extensionality, since the coextensional kinds, creature with a heart and creature with a kidney, are distinct. I don't know a lot about set theory, so it feels a little funny to be saying these kinds of things, but I wanted to give you some sense of how I think about kinds. I'm very liberal, I guess, about them. I think of 2 as assuming an analog of restricted comprehension, roughly that for any kind and for any way of restricting that kind, there's a kind of the restricted sort, right? And 2 assumes that there's a kind matter, so that the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O is a kind that can be, obtained, so to speak, from by restricting the kind matter. And of course, 2 also assumes that there's a kind water. Although I recognize that I tend to be fairly liberal ontologically, I doubt that rejecting 2, on the grounds that we're not really making reference to kinds, I doubt that rejecting 2 is all that tempting, even to those who are a little more ontologically conservative than I am. It might be that there are some bizarre kinds that conservatives want to say no to. So I give this example from Reference in Essence. Nathan talks about the kind member of a species that serves as mascot for Princeton University, right, where that phrase is a rigid designator for a kind whose metaphysical intention is a function that when you feed it the actual world, it gets you, the set of tigers. When you feed it a possible world in which Princeton chose the raccoon for its mascot, right, it gets you the set of raccoons, and that might feel like too messed up a kind for some people. But I think, surely it's one thing to say no to a weird kind like that, and it's another thing to say no to a kind like matter composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. All right, so the next possibility that I want to explore is rejecting 4. So what are the prospects for rejecting 4? Someone attracted to this solution might say something like this. What one can know a priori is the de dicto claim that all instances of the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O are composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O. But just as one can know, sorry, I've got this written both in the correct way, and that's how I feel forced to say it, but it decreases understanding, so I'm going to be sloppy first. So just as one can know a priori that the shortest spy is a spy, without knowing a priori of the shortest spy that he's a spy, so one can know a priori that all instances of the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen are composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen without knowing a priori of the kind matter composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, that all instances of it are composed basically of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. I'll just leave it in the sloppy formulation. If you need a less sloppy one, I'll try to say all those things, although it's almost as hard as saying unlimited, I can't do it either. According to this line of thought, 4 rests on the mistaken assumption that because one can know the corresponding de dicto claim a priori, the de re claim involved in 4 can also be known a priori. So the first thing I want to say against this is that I didn't argue for 4 on the basis of exporting right from the de dicto to the de re. In support of 4, I offered only that it seemed to be of a piece with a number of other cases, right? So I said, it seems like we can know a priori of the kind bachelor, that all of its instances are, unmarried, and so on. So I said that it seemed to be of a piece with a number of other cases in which we are intuitively inclined to say that we know a priori of a kind that all of its instances are a certain way. Next thing I want to say about it is that it would have been fine if I had argued for 4 on the basis of exportation. The examples that I offered to lend support to 4 all have the feature of being de re claims that are expressible by sentences that are legitimately inferable by exportation from sentences that express the corresponding de dicto claims. Of course, it's an interesting question just why exportation is legitimate here. I'm really far from having a full-blown theory about this. Nonetheless, I have some tentative things to say. So it's pretty clear that common noun phrases that designate kinds have definite descriptions associated with them. Right? For example, matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O has associated with it some description like the kind of matter that is composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O, or maybe the kind intersection of the kind matter and the kind composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O, or in generality, as Nathan says, it's the kind appropriately determined by the propositional function indicated by what X is matter and X is composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O. But some description like that seems to be quite not obviously associated with this common noun phrase, matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O. It's plausible to think that a common noun phrase's associated definite description has one of 2 roles, right? Either it merely fixes the referent of the common noun phrase, or it gives the semantic content of that phrase. So suppose it's the former. Suppose it just fixes the referent. In that case, I take it the common noun phrase is million, and its semantic content is simply the kind that the associated description picks out. It's relatively uncontroversial that it's legitimate to export a million term over the context one knows a priori that. So if common noun phrases are million, then they're exportable in the relevant way, and 4 shouldn't be rejected. Okay, suppose instead now that the associated description gives the semantic content of the common noun phrase, right? So the descriptivism is true for these compound common noun phrases. Let me first observe that it's pretty clear that some definite descriptions are exportable in a priori knowledge contexts, right? In particular, certain definite descriptions that designate certain abstract entities are like this. Consider, for example, the description, the set that has 0 as its only member. One can know a priori the de dicto claim that the set that has 0 as its only member has 0 as its only member. And it follows from this that one can know a priori of that set that it has 0 as a member. But not all definite descriptions designating the set are exportable in this way. So let's imagine that my daughter Yoko has a favorite set, right? Namely, the set whose only member is 0. So that the definite description, the set that has 0 as its only member, and Yoko's favorite set, my daughter's as I said that, are co-designative. One can know a priori the de dicto claim that Yoko's favorite set is a favorite of Yoko, but it does not follow that one can know a priori of Yoko's favorite set that it's a favorite of hers. What's so special about the description, the set that has 0 as its only member? Why is it that one is de re a priori knowledge connected to the set that has 0 as its only member through that description? I'm not entirely sure, but one thing that jumps out is that if anything is going to get you en rapport, to use David Kaplan's phrase from quantifying in, if anything's going to get you en rapport with a set, it's thinking of it as the set that has 0 as its only member. So suppose I ask you to think of the set that has 0 as its only member. If I ask you to do this, and you understand my request, you're able to comply with it. Indeed, like it or not, you can hardly fail to comply with it if you're understanding my request. The description that I used to designate the set in some sense gives you the set. It identifies the set. It wouldn't make sense for you to say to me, well, what is the set that has 0 as its only member? Or sorry, what set is the set that has 0 as its only member? It's a Kripkean buck stopper. So that's a phrase that Saul has used in a number of lectures where he's talking about numbers. It's plausible that one is de re a priori knowledge connected to the reference of such identifying descriptions through those descriptions. Contrast this with the description, Yoko's favorite set. If I ask you to think of Yoko's favorite set, you might just happen to think of the right set, but your understanding my request doesn't lead to compliance with it in the way that your understanding my request to think of the set that has 0 as its only member does. The description, Yoko's favorite set, doesn't give you the set, it doesn't identify it. It makes perfectly good sense for you to ask in response to my request, well, what set is Yoko's favorite set? Kinds, whatever exactly they are naturally taken to be abstract entities, and certain definite descriptions that designate them seem to be relevantly like certain definite descriptions, like the set that has 0 as its only member. So they're like certain definite descriptions that designate certain other abstract entities. So suppose I ask you to think about the kind of girl who's brown-eyed, or the kind intersection of the kind girl and the kind brown-eyed thing, or the kind appropriately determined by the propositional function. X is a girl and X is brown-eyed. As long as you understand my request, you're able to comply with it. The description that I used to designate the kind, in some sense, gives you the kind. It identifies it. If you understand what kind intersection is and what the kinds girl and brown-eyed thing are, it would make no sense for you to say to me, well, which kind is the kind intersection of the kind girl and the kind brown-eyed thing? You've already been given a buck-stopping description. Again, a contrasting case is helpful. Consider the description John's favorite kind, which we can, let's say, designates the kind brown-eyed girl. If I ask you to think of John's favorite kind, you might just happen to think of the right kind, but your understanding my request isn't what leads you to compliance with it in the way that your understanding my request to think of the kind brown-eyed girl does. The description John's favorite kind doesn't give you the kind, it doesn't identify it, it makes perfectly good sense for you to ask in response to my request, well, what kind is John's favorite kind? The point is that it at least seems plausible to think that the definite descriptions that are associated with common noun phrases are such as to identify the relevant kind. Thus, it's plausible to think that these descriptions are exportable over one can know a priori that. If that's right, then even though there's no reason to think that all general definite descriptions are exportable in such contexts, there's some reason to think that the ones that, on this horn of our dilemma, give the meaning of common noun phrases are, and hence that common noun phrases are too. So either way, right, whether the definite description that's associated with a compound common noun phrase merely fixes the referent, or whether it gives the meaning of the compound common noun phrase, there are strong reasons to think that common noun phrases are exportable in a priori knowledge contexts. And let's see, I think, Reno, in your presentation, yeah, you pointed out that, Nathan in this recent paper proposes that not only that single word general terms like horse, but also general term phrases like unmarried man are million. And I just, it's interesting to me that I think it's difficult to say how you decide between these two horns of the dilemma that I'm presenting, right? Whether the definite description that's associated with the common noun phrase just fixes the referent of the common noun phrase, or whether it gives the meaning. And I guess Nathan would say that it just fixes the referent. I want the standard arguments then to work, or the standard arguments against descriptivism to work, but it doesn't seem to me that they have any purchase in the case of common noun phrases. Right? The descriptions associated with common noun phrases are rigid, they're a priori in a sense that's clarified below, and they're identifying, and so the modal, epistemic, and semantic arguments don't work. Right? So just quickly reminding you how these work so you can see why this is the case. So one argues, and here I'm going to give the modal and epistemic arguments, that the meaning of girdle is or of water is not the same as that of the discoverer of the incompleteness of arithmetic, or the meaning of water isn't the same as the meaning of the colorless, odorless, thirst-quenching liquid that fills the lakes and streams, right? By pointing out that the expression, the proposition expressed by, I guess I'll start with the water one, the proposition expressed by water fills the lakes and streams is neither necessary nor knowable a priori, whereas the colorless, odorless, thirst-quenching liquid that fills the lakes and streams is both, right? It's both necessary and knowable a priori. But you can't argue similarly that the meaning of brown-eyed girl isn't the same as the meaning of the kind intersection of the kind brown-eyed thing and the kind girl, since the proposition expressed by all instances of the kind brown-eyed girl or brown-eyed is necessary and knowable a priori, just as all instances of the kind intersection of the kind brown-eyed thing and the kind girl are brown-eyed is. One argues, and here I'll give the semantic, so there's the modal and epistemic arguments, and then turning to the semantic argument, one argues that the meaning of girdle is not the same as that of the discoverer of the incompleteness of arithmetic, by pointing out that if it turned out that Schmidt and not Gödel uniquely discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic, Gödel would still refer to Gödel and not to the discoverer of the incompleteness of arithmetic, that is, not to Schmidt. Similarly, one argues that the meaning of water is not the same as that of the colorless, odorless, thirst-quenching liquid that fills the lakes and streams, by pointing out that if it turned out that methane and not water is the colorless, odorless, thirst-quenching liquid that fills the lakes and streams, the word water would still refer to water and not to the colorless, odorless, thirst-quenching liquid that fills the lakes and streams, that is, not to methane. Since in the case of a common noun phrase, the associated description is an identifying description, it can't turn out that the common noun phrase refers to something other than the referent of the associated description. So I think the semantic argument against descriptivism about common noun phrases also isn't available. It's just sort of an aside. Anyway, I guess back to the main line of the puzzle, what I want to consider next is simply accepting conclusion 5. I guess I've already said a little bit about this with the stuff that I put on the board. So what are the prospects for simply accepting the argument to 5, or in other words, rejecting the intuition that one cannot know a priori of the kind water, that all of its instances are composed of 2 parts H and 1 part O? Prospects look dim at first, since our knowledge about the kind water, that all instances of it are composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O, is generally taken to be a paradigm case of knowledge that can be gained only empirically. That's certainly true, but even though the possibility of accepting the argument to 5 is dim, I don't think that it can just be rejected out of hand in the way that I think, the possibility of accepting the conclusion of a Sorites argument can be rejected out of hand, even though, of course, some philosophers do just that. Anyway, Millionism about at least certain expressions, most familiarly ordinary proper names, has emerged as a serious contender in contemporary philosophy of language, and there's a great deal of pressure on millions to accept that certain claims that initially strike one as knowable only empirically are in fact knowable a priori. Right? So it's no news that standard millions like Salmon and Soames yield to this pressure and accept it as a consequence of their view that it's knowable a priori that Hesperus is phosphorus. You might object to this line of thought by pointing out that the case at hand is very different from the Hesperus-phosphorus case. In particular, the claim at hand is not an identity claim, but rather something more like the claim Queen Elizabeth is the child of George VI than Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. And although Kripkean naming and necessity treated the claim that Hesperus is phosphorus and the claim that Queen Elizabeth is the child of George VI and Elizabeth Bowes Lyon on a par, right, considering both to be examples of the necessary a posteriori, millions do not. Millions may say that it's knowable a priori that Hesperus is phosphorus, but even millions think some empirical investigation is needed in order to discover the facts of Queen Elizabeth's parentage. That's right, but one who accepts 5 has a little bit more to say. Right? Both Salmon and Soames accept not only that certain expressions that designate individuals are million, but also that certain expressions that designate propositions are. For example, they both hold that the single word logicism and the phrase that mathematics is reducible to logic. Right? They take both of those to be million names for the proposition that mathematics is reducible to logic. That is to say, both expressions have that proposition as both semantic, content, and referent. This puts pressure on them to accept that it's knowable a priori, that if logicism is true, then mathematics is not irreducible, sorry for all those nods, since co-designative million names are intersubstitutable salva veritate in the context, it's knowable a priori that. Exportation of logicism, which millionism about that word sanctions, yields that it's knowable a priori of logicism, that if it's true, then mathematics is not irreducible. And that looks an awful lot like 5. For this reason, I think we do have to take seriously the possibility of accepting 5. Even so, I'm not inclined toward this solution, mostly because it feels like it's way too much to accept when there's another reasonable way to solve the puzzle, and then I have some other reasons, but I'm not very confident of them. And then there's also the fact that when we import, we get something that well, it's very hard to accept that we know empirically that all instances of the kind water compose basically, no a priori, that all instances of the kind water are composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O. All right, so now I want to talk about rejecting the first claim, which is what I'm inclined to do. So when I made my initial remarks about the elements of the puzzle, I said that I think that 1 has a reasonable degree of intuitive support. But if you think more carefully about the quotation from Soames, so let me read that again. It's hard to imagine 2 distinct species of animal, 2 distinct substances, or 2 distinct colors which have precisely the same instances in every possible world state. Okay, so if you think more carefully about the quotation, you can see that there's a gulf between Soames's intuition and 1, or even the weaker claim that sameness of metaphysical intention is sufficient for sameness of manifest natural kind. Right. Soames says that intuitively, if species K and K prime have the same metaphysical intention, they're the same species, and similarly for substances K and K prime and colors K and K prime. But this intuition is perfectly compatible with there being a substance K and a co-intentional kind K, right, that K prime, sorry, that is not a substance, right, like the substance water, and the kind, then matter composed basically of 2 parts H and 1 part O. That's good news for the possibility of solving the puzzle by rejecting 1. Rejecting 1 doesn't commit us to rejecting the intuition that Scott cites. In my initial remarks, I also mentioned Salmon's claim that it's not implausible that kinds having the same metaphysical intention are identical. Not implausible on a first look, sure, but the puzzle presented in the paper does make it less plausible on a second look. And then I just say that when I presented Nathan with this puzzle, right, there was a response he gave. So he thinks it would be metaphysically impossible for the Beatles to have existed without John Lennon's having been a member, right? It was a very important metaphysical fact to Nathan. Anyway, so he suggested the following 2 kinds as distinct, even though they're alike in metaphysical intention, right? The kind brown-eyed girl and the kind girl whose eyes are brown and who was such that John Lennon was a member of the Beatles if the band existed, right? These 2 kinds do not come apart in any metaphysically possible worlds, but they do come apart in some metaphysically impossible ones, right? Ones in which there are brown-eyed girls and the Beatles existed without John Lennon's having been a member, right? I think, therefore, that the prospects for solving the puzzle by rejecting 1 are good. Of course, it would take a great deal more investigation to substantiate this initial assessment.
You can
Right, now don't ask me what cons are.
coordinate.
Some question?
I have I understand, are you presenting a problem for the notion of metaphysical intention?
No, I just think it's it's tempting to think that the way we individuate kinds, right? Well, I just think one is tempting, right? I think it's tempting to think that kinds that have the same metaphysical intentions, right? If you got these kinds and they cannot, it's impossible for them to differ in their instances. I think there's a kind of natural tendency to think, well, that's all there is, those are the same kinds, right? So I guess I think one is a fairly natural thought, but I think there are these fairly strong considerations against it. And I think two of my teachers took one very seriously, right? And it's always gratifying to question your elders.
Yeah.
So it's really just adolescent rebellion.
Teresa, I'm not sure I understood exactly. I'm a little confused about something. You said, if I understood, that there are some descriptions under which we capture kinds that we may be able to export outside the epistemic operator.
Right.
Do you think of any example of it outside mathematics? Can you give an example?
Let's see. So, I mean, the mathematical examples.
That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, so the mathematical example that I was giving, that wasn't a case of exporting a kind term, right? I mean, it was a term for a set, right? And then, I guess I think these kinds of examples like brown-eyed girl, or sorry, the definite description associated with that phrase, that is the kind intersection of the kind brown, the kind brown-eyed thing, maybe, and the kind girl, right? That whole definite description, it seems to me, is exportable over this knowledge, de re a priori knowledge operator. So maybe you're asking me, can you kind of give another example besides a mathematical example where we can export these definite descriptions over the de re a priori knowledge operator. Nothing leaps to mind.
I don't know, that clause, like logicism, Jones believes that Frege held logicism, therefore Jones believes of logicism. But that's not really.
Yeah, I don't know if that's going to help the case. I mean,
you're looking for a description, but you can definite description.
A description of. You need a description. You need a description of logicism, right? That you can.
Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Isn't 4 itself supposed to be of this kind because you have already exported it here? 4, the kind matter composed basically of 2.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that Marco was asking. I mean, since I sort of supported this move by saying, look, I mean, we see this in other places, and and he asked me, well, can you give me something that's not mathematical? Why do you want something?
Sorry.
No, this one's not mathematical.
Right, this one isn't, but I took him to be asking, I was using, I said, well, look, we've seen this in other areas, and to try to make it plausible that something like that is okay here. And so I'm thinking, you think, well, it's not fair for me to say, well, here's your non-mathematical example.
Oh.
So, maybe I didn't understand correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, so it wouldn't be fair for me to say what I said at the beginning.
I suppose it would be better if you had many examples, but here's one. If he wants one, here's one. If he wants two, then maybe.
Well, but you want to argue for the plausibility. You want to argue for the plausibility of 4,
Right.
Yeah.
right? And you're saying at least in some cases it's plausible to
Right.
do that.
Right.
And 4 is plausible. That,
Right.
Right, yeah, I mean, that would be,
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
She
sure.
wants
that would
other
be
examples.
kosher.
May I ask?
It has to be small again.
Very small. Do you think that the notion of a priori needs...
Oh, this already sounds big.
No, it's only about your feelings. Only about your intuitions. The notion, the discussion of a priori needs of another treatment of intention, or you prefer to preserve this notion of intention in give another treatment of a priori.
I'm not sure I understand. I'm not sure I understand the question, but it feels like it's related to Marco's question in Curitiba. But can you help me out? Do you understand this question? You're usually much better
Can you say it
than I
again?
am at getting an underlying thought.
The point is, we preserve the notion, the typical the notion of the typical understanding of a priori in philosophy. And maybe, if this is the case, the notion of metaphysical intention have this problem. Or the notion of metaphysical intention is perfect, and we have a problem to the classical notion of a priori.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure.
No,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm getting this, but I feel like what I should do is stress that there's nothing. I'm not in here. It's not like I talk about knowing some proposition a priori, and then I don't also talk about the necessity of that proposition, right? The metaphysical intention part is coming in just because that's a thesis about how we individuate kinds, right? I mean, what we take, or how we identify kinds, what we take to be sufficient for sameness of kind. So, I guess, in some way I'm not at all concerned with, well, here's this proposition, is it both necessary and a priori? I mean, the only sort of property of propositions that I'm really working with is knowability a priori. And there's, I don't really talk about, I could, but I don't talk about whether the proposition is metaphysically necessary or not, right? The sort of metaphysical part comes in just because I'm examining this thesis that metaphysical intention is in fact sufficient for sameness of kind, right? That there's nothing sort of more to kinds beyond their, instances across possible worlds. And I don't know whether that addresses the question, but I guess I felt in Curitiba that there was some kind of confusion about what work this notion of metaphysical intention was doing.
That's fine.
Let's see, I'm going to go back to Marco's question. In number 4, the phrase that you're exporting, let's see. You're trying to support 4, and one way to do it is by exportation.
Right.
And the term on which you're exporting is not a definite description. It's
Right, but I'm examining, I mean, I've got,
Yes.
okay.
And you support it by saying, well, suppose it means the same thing as a definite description. Some definite descriptions can be exported, like the set that has 0 as its own element. And Marco says, well, yeah, but can you think of anything that's not mathematical? And I said, well, maybe a that clause. And I also now think that would work, and also a property term like being tall. That stands for a property. Now, a term like being tall or a that clause, like that mathematics is reducible to logic, would be subject to the same question. What is its meaning? What's its meaning? And it might be that it's a million expression, a million term for the property, or for the thesis that mathematics is reducible to logic, in which case it ought to be exportable just the same way this ought to be. Or it might be that it's a definite description, or it has the content.
It's the same dilemma that I'm
Same dilemma, but it's not. These are not coming from mathematics. Right? These are terms like being tall.
Yeah, but I guess I was thinking that's not fair game because the same questions are going to arise there. I mean, I feel like Marco.
Well, but isn't that clearly exportable? Suppose being tall, somebody knows a priori that the property of being tall is a property that tall people have. We do know that, right? So can't we export on that? Even if being tall turns out to be, even if its content turns out to be descriptive, we know that we know a priori that the property of being tall is a property that tall people have. We also know a priori of that property, being tall, that it's a property that tall people have, right? And that would be true regardless of what its content is, right? And similarly we know a priori that the proposition that mathematics is reducible to logic is a proposition that discusses about mathematics, the foundations of mathematics. So we also know a priori of the thesis that mathematics is reducible to logic, that it's a proposition in the foundations of mathematics. Even if it turns out that the that clause has the content of a description,